Recording started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here with us today. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the manager of College Access and Outreach, and here to talk with you today about the FAFSA. With me, I have Michelle Radley and Nikki Vachon from FAME. So they are going to be watching the Q&A. So please submit your questions and they will either answer them, but I will also stop periodically because there might be some that they think are a good thing for me to answer in front of all of you because there are questions that are applicable to many people. This presentation is being recorded. It will be sent automatically to all registrants. The link will be in the next couple of days. So if you want to re-listen or you want to leave early or share it with somebody else, we really do appreciate that. Because of this topic today, we are going to go a little bit longer. We're going to do a 90-minute session instead of a 60-minute session. As much as we've tried to fit this into 60 minutes some years, we always run over. So we're just going to make it 90 because we do want to be sure you have an opportunity to ask your questions. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what we are going to do today is we're going to talk about what needs to be done before the FAFSA can be filed, and that's creating FSA IDs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time actually walking through the FAFSA. So we're going to walk through the scenario where a dependent student starts the FAFSA. And then we'll talk a little bit about what happens if the dependent student has their parents starting the FAFSA, but we will also throw in some hints and tips related to independent students and talk about other scenarios. And then we'll roll up the session by talking about some FAFSA resources that are available to you and to your students and families that we hope will be helpful. So again, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, but please put in any questions that you have, and I will stop at the end of the FSA ID session and take whatever questions we have. All right, so let's talk about FSA ID. So this is one of those things where federal student aid is leaning towards just calling them student aid accounts, but we know a lot of people still recognize the term FSA ID. But the creating of a federal student aid account is the first step in the FAFSA filing process. Accounts are created at studentaid.gov. There used to be multiple sites for people who have been around a bit, but now everything is under that studentaid.gov umbrella. When someone creates an account, an individual sets up their unique username and password. And that's what we refer to as the FSA ID. So if we say to a student, have you created your FSA ID yet? What we actually mean is, have you gone to studentaid.gov, set up your account, which does include setting up a username and password. That FSA ID or that username and password is going to be required to access the FAFSA and all federal student aid processes and serves as the legal signature. So for example, it's how you get into studentaid.gov, it's how you access the FAFSA, that's how you sign the FAFSA. If students are going to borrow a federal student loan, it's how they're going to sign their master promissory note, it's how they're going to log into studentaid.gov and see their loans that they borrowed. So this one step is a critical step in this process and the most important first step. So when people create an account, an individual is going to provide their identifying information, including their name, their date of birth, and their social security number, excuse me. All of this is going to be matched against the Social Security Administration. So for people who have a Social Security number, this is how federal student aid is confirming that you are you. When we're doing FAFSA stuff, when we're transferring information from the IRS, which we're going to talk more about today, it's really important that people feel like their information is secure and protected. So one of the ways that this happens is that when people create that account and provide this information, it is matched against the Social Security Administration and verified. And once it's been verified, an individual can see that in their federal student aid account. Now, individuals do need to use a unique email address that can be accessed when they're creating their account, because when you're creating your account, you do have to go through two-step verification or authentication, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And we want to be sure that students are not using their high school email address. Because of this two-step verification and authentication process that is going to be used every time someone logs in, using their FSA ID, we want to be sure that it is an account that students are going to have access to for years to come. So this is not just a one-time thing. So if students haven't yet created a personal email account, this is the time to do it. Whether it's a Gmail account or a Yahoo account or a Hotmail account, something that they will have as they finish up high school, that they'll have after high school when they're in college, and then even have afterwards. So it's really important that people use that personal account, not their high school account. Now, if you know a student that has already created their account and they use their high school email address, they can go back in and update that. So that's not that big a deal, but it's just easier if they use that personal email account to start with. Ideally, we'd like to have students provide their mobile phone number. That is optional, but strongly recommended because of this two-step verification process that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. Individuals, when they're setting up their account, will also need to select and answer 4 challenge questions. And so we have lots of resources available on FSA ID creation, but today what we just want to convey is the importance of people getting that FSA ID created. Now, this two-step verification process that I keep mentioning is at the very end of the FSA ID creation, one of the very last steps. And basically what they want to be sure of is that the individual creating the account is them. And there's a couple of ways that they can verify that you're you. You can use a one-time passcode from an authenticator app. But I think what most of us do, I know this is what I do anytime I log in, I have to use my username and password. And then for me, I tend to send myself a text. So I would go and I would click on this send code. I'm going to get a text on my phone, and then I'm going to put in that code into the system, and then I can continue and proceed. That can also be done by email. So what we want is people to have as many options as possible. Okay, because again, this is going to be required every single time someone logs in. So students have got to have access, individuals have got to have access to the email and to the phone number that's associated with their account. Now, new thing last year is that parents specifically in this case, without a social security number can now create a federal student aid account. They didn't used to be able to. So I just want to make it really clear that students have to have a social security number. They have to be an eligible non-citizen or a US citizen in order to be eligible for federal student aid. Now, there are a handful of people from other locations. Some of our, I'm drawing a blank on the specific, Micronesia is one of them, where they don't have to have an SSN. But let's just say for today's purposes, assume that every single student needs to have a regular SSN because they are a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen in order to be eligible for federal student aid. However, their parents don't have to be, and their parents have never had to be. So we may have people living here in Maine, the students are eligible non-citizens, but their parents are not, and their parents might not even have a social security number. In the past, what used to happen is those parents would print out a paper signature page and they would send those in. But federal student aid said, no more of this. What we want instead is for these individuals to get a federal student aid account and to sign the FAFSA with that username and password, just like everybody else does. So they created this process as part of the new Better FAFSA that they rolled out last year. Well, it's still not working 100%. So we're in a little bit of this weird situation currently. But basically, the process for parents who don't have a social security number to set up a federal student aid account is virtually identical, with a couple of minor exceptions, which may not feel so minor. One is that when they go to put in their social security number and they don't have one, they're going to click on this box and it's going to have a pop-up and it's going to confirm that they don't have a social security number. What they don't want people doing is just say, oh, I don't have my social security number with me, but I want to go ahead and do this now. No, no, no. If you've got a social security number, you have to use it when you're creating your FSA ID, and it has to be accurate. Okay, so this is only for people who don't have one. The other thing is at the end, they've got to be able to verify the identity of all of these individuals, right? So we're getting verified if we have a social security number by that check with the Social Security Administration. But for people who don't have a social security number, the way that their identity is being verified is that if there's enough information on file with TransUnion, these individuals are going to see 4 knowledge-based questions. And if they answer them correctly, their identity will be verified. Okay, so they'll be good to go. They'll have a verified FSA ID. If there's not enough information with TransUnion, apparently the match, they have to match on addresses and stuff. It has to be absolutely perfect at this point in time. It's something that they're working on. But what we're finding is for a lot of people, there's not that match with TransUnion is not happening. So in that case, or in a scenario where they've answered the questions but not correctly, then those individuals are going to have to go through an additional process in order to verify their identity. They will receive instructions at the end of this, when they don't answer the question or there's not enough information, they'll be told what they need to provide and how they need to provide it. And this is how their identity will be verified. There was a tremendous backlog of documents that had not been processed. So what Federal Student Aid said, I think it was in March of last year, was that parents without a social security number who created an FSA ID that had not yet been verified could go ahead and use that FSA ID, even though it hadn't been verified. Their tax information will not come over, but they are good to go so their students can get their FAFSA submitted. That is going to continue into the 25-26 year. But here's what I want you to know if you're working with these individuals, is that at some point, they are going to need to have those FSA IDs verified. So what they're saying now is they've waived that requirement. People can use their FSA IDs, but they still need to send in their paperwork because we need them to be prepared for when the time comes that they have to be verified, okay? There had been a backlog of paperwork that has all been cleared. So if people going through this process get their paperwork sent in, they should hear pretty quickly. We're hearing within a couple of weeks that their FSA ID information has been verified. That will allow their tax information, if they have any on file, to be sent over and into their FAFSA. Okay, so a little bit of, I know we don't have a tremendous number of families in this situation, but of all of the challenges last year, this was where one of the most significant challenges was. So it is slowly getting better, but we just want to be sure that individuals who don't have an SSN, those parents, create an account, send in their documentation, but know in the meantime they can go ahead and use their username and password to get their students' FAFSA completed. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about who needs to have an FSA ID. So the individuals who need to have an FSA ID is anyone considered to be a contributor on the FAFSA. And this was a new term last year. So a contributor is anyone who is providing information on the FAFSA that is required to provide consent by clicking approve to have their federal tax information shared with federal student aid. And we're going to go over this in more detail as we walk through the FAFSA. But that's how we determine when we're working with students and families and we're talking about who needs an FSA ID. I don't know that we always use this language because sometimes it can be confusing, but basically anyone who's officially considered a contributor has to have an FSA ID. Every student is considered a contributor. Every single student who's applying needs to have their own FSA ID. That is absolutely a given. Other possible contributors would include the parent spouse, or the student spouse, okay? So this is not a black and white answer. It's a, well, it depends on your situation. So now let's talk a little bit about those various situations and the questions that we're going to ask individuals to determine exactly who are considered to be contributors. So let's talk about the situation where we have a dependent student, okay? So parent information is required on the FAFSA. So in that situation, we're going to start asking questions like, what's your parents' marital status and what's your parents' tax filing status? Because that's what this all comes down to. So in the case where parents are married to each other, biological or adopted parents are married to each other, and they filed a 2023 tax return, because that's the base year for this year's FAFSA. This is the year of tax income we're using. If in 2023 they filed a joint tax return, then information for both parents will be on the FAFSA, but only one parent will need to sign in with an FSA ID. And that's because one parent, if you file a joint tax return, can grant consent for their tax information to be transferred on behalf of both parents. So my husband and I filed a joint tax return in 2023. If I was going to go in and complete the FAFSA as a parent, I would be the only person who would need to have an FSA ID. I would provide my husband's information, and you'll see in a moment how you do that. But he would not need to log in with an FSA ID. I could do that on behalf of both of us because we signed and filed a joint tax return. Now, let's think about parents who are married, but maybe they filed separate tax returns in 2023, or maybe they're parents who live together, but they aren't married. So if they weren't married, they couldn't file a joint tax return, or maybe they didn't file taxes at all. In this scenario, both parents' information is going to be required on the FAFSA, just like in the previous scenario. But in this situation, both parents will need their own FSA ID. And the reason that both parents will need their own FSA ID is because if we filed separate tax returns, let's go back to my husband and I, let's say we filed separate tax returns in 2023, I cannot grant consent to have his taxes transferred over. He can't grant consent to have my taxes transferred over. So both parents have to log in with an FSA ID and provide consent to have that happen. Now, when we have a situation where parents are divorced, separated, never married, okay, these are the biological or adopted parents, this is more of a two-step process. So the first step in the process is to determine which parent needs to be the parent on the FAFSA, because again, let's say parents are divorced, live in two separate households. The parent who is going to need to be the parent on the FAFSA is the parent who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. So that's the parent who's going to be on the FAFSA. The other one doesn't have anything to do with the FAFSA. CSS profile is different, but with the FAFSA, they have nothing to do with this. So let's just say I'm the student and my parents are divorced. I spend time with both parents, but my mother provides 60% of my financial support and my dad provides 40% of my financial support. My mother's going to be the parent on the FAFSA. My dad doesn't have anything to do with the FAFSA. Okay, so my mom is going to get an FSA ID and she is going to be the parent who's going to complete the parent section of my FAFSA. Now I've got one more piece to this though. I have to know what is mom's marital status on the day the FAFSA is filed. Let's just say that mom is not married and then it's only going to be mom's information on the FAFSA and only mom needs to log in as a parent. But let's say mom has remarried. If mom has remarried, then her spouse, the step parent's information will have to be on the FAFSA as well, okay? Even if mom just got married last week, her spouse's information is going to have to be on the FAFSA and the income is going to count, okay? Now, does that spouse need to have their own FSA ID? It depends, and you're probably going to guess where I'm headed. It depends on their tax filing status for 2023. If mom has been remarried for 5 years and she and stepdad filed a joint tax return in 2023, stepdad's information is on the FAFSA, but he does not need to get his own FSA ID and sign in, provide consent if they filed a joint tax return, because mom can do that on behalf of both of them. But let's just say mom got married last week. So stepdad's information's got to be on the FAFSA. And additionally, stepdad would need to get his own FSA ID because if they got married last week, unless we got some wacky set of circumstances with remarriage, they did not file a joint tax return, a married joint tax return together in 2023. So therefore, stepdad needs his own FSA ID as well. Okay? We'll stop in just a moment if we have questions. So FSA IDs should be created at least a couple of days prior to filing the FAFSA. The FAFSA is going to come out on December 1st. Every indication is that everything is on track for that. So what I've been saying to families is, first of all, get them done as soon as you can, but certainly by the end of Thanksgiving weekend, be sure that you have created your FSA IDs. And the reason is because you can go ahead and create an FSA ID and file a tax form or file a FAFSA immediately, excuse me. But here's the downside to it, or here's how you don't want to do that, is because when you create your FSA ID and it's been matched with the Social Security Administration, if you've got tax information on file, it's just going to be transferred into the FAFSA. And that's one of the things that is making the FAFSA so much easier to complete. So if your verification hasn't taken place, if your identity hasn't been verified, your information hasn't been matched, that information cannot come over from the IRS. And you can't provide official consent yet. So that's just going to make the rest of the process so much more difficult. So what we want to be sure of is that everyone creates their FSA IDs and have them matched before they file their FAFSA. So that's the general rule of thumb. We've got a few exceptions to that, but for today, let's just assume that always the best case scenario is for everyone to get those FSA IDs ahead of time, allow time for them to be matched before they file their FAFSA. And again, when you log back into your FSA ID account, you can see whether or not it's been verified. And you should get an email. We're understanding that emails are being sent saying that that verification process has taken place. Now, when creating an FSA ID, we do have some worksheets available to keep track of this information. So we have one for students, we have one for parents, and we also have one for parents who don't have a Social Security number. So we have a couple of different forms. We'd love to have you use these forms just because we want you to keep track of this information. Always keep it in a safe place, just like you would your tax information. But again, this FSA ID is not a one-time thing. You have to file your FAFSA every year. And so you have to use your FSA ID every time you log into studentaid.gov. And for those students who do borrow and maybe do public service loan forgiveness, they're going to need to be signing in using that account for years and years to come. So where do you go to do that? When you go to studentaid.gov, you will see the login or create account. For someone who has not created an account, they will click on create an account. If they already have one, they log in. If you're logging in on a mobile phone, you're not going to see quite the same thing. You're going to click on the little person, and then you'll have the ability to log in or to create an account. Okay, so everything lives on studentaid.gov in terms of everything federal student aid related. All right, I'm going to take a second, take a pause, and see from either Nikki or Michelle if there are any questions that you want me to address before continuing on.
Sure. Yeah, there's one question, Mila. Nikki did a great job providing her thoughts on it as well, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. So one person asked, what are the odds that the feds move away from the term parent to account for students who don't have parents?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the situations where student might have a unique situation where the parent is either not involved or no longer living. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So I don't see them moving away from using the term parent. Okay, because I think that they have a scenario for students who don't have a typical situation where they have parents who are identified in
Awesome.
their lives. Okay, but we will go through a lot of that, okay, in the next couple of sections. I see
Sure.
one more question just popped in.
Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and read that for you, Mila?
Uh, duh, 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 duh. Yeah, I'm okay. I can see this. So let me just address these couple of questions. If parents are living together and filed separately, do they split assets when listing? This was confusing this last year. So they would list so when determining what we're trying to determine here, if parents are living together and filing separately, they would list all of their assets because for the purposes of federal financial aid, parents who are married and living together and parents who are not married and living together are looked at the same way. And all of their combined income and all of their combined assets should be provided on the FAFSA. Okay.
But would you
Another question.
create
Oh,
those
sorry.
I'm sorry to jump in, but would you separate those assets and do half the assets in one, half the assets in another, or should maybe one parent do all of the assets?
They're only going to have the opportunity for one parent to list all the assets. Yes, yes, yes. And actually, Nikki, I'm glad you said it that way because I wasn't thinking of it that way. And what we'll do is when I get to that section, I'll try to make sure I point that out. If I don't, remind me to, okay? Um, yeah, I think when I go through the parent section, it will make a little bit more sense how that's handled. Let me just do one more question. If students are divorced, but both claim the child, do they both need to create an ID? I don't think if they both should be claiming the child. I think that the way that the tax laws work, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I don't believe both parents could be claiming the child as a dependent on their taxes. But that does bring up another important point to mention, that it actually, in determining which parent is going to be on the FAFSA, has nothing to do with who claims the child. So there are scenarios where the parent who claims the child might be the parent on the FAFSA because they provide more than half of the financial support, but it could go the other way as well. It could be that they just alternate which years they claim the student. And so, they might be the parent who, goes the other way. So it doesn't have anything to do with who claims the student. It's who provides the most financial support and who has done that in the last 12 months. All right. Okay, let's jump in. So the new FAFSA is a roles-based form. I'm going to give credit to Nikki because she came up with this great screen that's interactive. So the new FAFSA is roles-based. And what I mean by that is that there is a student section on the FAFSA and there is a parent section on the FAFSA. The student only sees student questions and the parent only sees parent questions typically, okay? Either the student or the parent can start the FAFSA, but families need to make a decision who is going to be the individual that starts the FAFSA. So this is how it works. Let's just say for the purposes of today that the student is going to be the one that is going to start the FAFSA. So the student will go to studentaid.gov. They'll log in with their FSA ID. We're going to walk through this in just a moment. And they will indicate that they want to file a 25-26 FAFSA. So just to be clear, when people go to file a FAFSA right now, or after December 1st, there'll be 2 years of a FAFSA out there. You're always doing the FAFSA for the year you need the financial aid for. So like our high school seniors are doing the 25-26 FAFSA. So they will click on that, and then they will see this screen, and it will ask them who they are. And in this case, it's the student who is logged in with their FSA ID, so they're going to indicate that they are the student, okay? Next thing that's going to happen is they're going to go through the student section, which we're going to do in a moment, and they are going to determine that they do need to provide parent information. So it's going to ask them who their parent is. So they're going to provide information about their parent, and that is going to get an invitation sent to their parent. And we're going to show you more details on that in a moment. The parent will then, when they log into studentaid.gov with their FSA ID, we'll see that they've got the opportunity to complete the parent section of the FAFSA on behalf of their student. It can go the other way though, too. So I could log in as a parent with my FSA ID. I could click on 25-26 FAFSA, but here I would say I was a parent. And then I would provide my student's information, and then my student would get an invitation, okay? So we're gonna walk through this, but before we even walked through it, I just wanted to provide that overarching scenario of how the two pieces get connected together. If the student starts it, they invite their parent clicks on the invitation, and they can complete the parent section. If the parent starts it, they send an invitation to the student logs in, accepts the invitation, and completes the student section. Then once both sections are completed is when the FAFSA can get submitted, okay? So I wanted to lay that out as we walk through this scenario, hoping that that would help it make more sense. Okay, so the scenario we're doing is we've got a dependent student, and the dependent student is going to be the one that starts the FAFSA. Okay, so when the student is going to start the FAFSA, let's just say that they go, directly here. they are going to start the form. Now you can see the 25-26 form will be there. There is still last year's form available as well. We have some college students who have still not filed their FAFSA yet. That's another whole issue, but they're going to do a 25-26 FAFSA. If the student has not logged in yet, maybe they had already logged in, but if they haven't logged in yet, the first thing they need to do to actually do their FAFSA is to log in with their FSA ID. I just want to point out here, they can use either or any of these options. They can use an email, their phone number, as long as those have been verified, or their username, and then of course their password. If they can't remember what their username is, they can click on forgot my username and they can retrieve that username. If they forgot their password, they can do that as well, and they can reset their password. And again, we have resources available to help people walk through this process if they need it. Let's just say they haven't created an account yet. Their other option is to create an account right now. When people are logging in, they often are required, every time I log in, I have to confirm my contact information. So that's nothing that seems to be wrong. It just seems to be how they set it up at the moment. So once the student has logged in, or is in the process of logging in, they're going to need to go through that two-step verification. Again, this happens every single time someone uses their FSA ID to log into their FAFSA. I have a FAFSA out there. I check it regularly when I want to look at something. Every time I log in, I have to go through this verification process. In my case, I usually prefer to have a text sent to me. So I get that text and I put it in here, and then I can continue. One of the reasons I want to emphasize why this is such a big deal is that no longer can a student fill out the FAFSA for their parent, or can the parent fill out their FAFSA for their student without them connecting with each other. So I went to do my son's FAFSA last year after all of this was in place, and he was at work. Well, I had his username and password, but I couldn't log in because he needed to get that verification code and put it into the system. Otherwise, I couldn't proceed. So it just means there does have to be some coordination between the student and the parent. One individual cannot do this whole process on behalf of the other. At a minimum, they've got to be in contact to at least get the verification code and enter, and the feds don't want you doing this as the other individual, okay? So then the student, because in this case it's the student, is going to indicate that they're a student, and they would click on student. There are then 4 videos that pop up, and they're what they call onboarding videos. And so you can see the first one here, what is the FAFSA? The 3 others are focus on contributors, what to expect, and what happens after the FAFSA is submitted. So these are good, helpful things that people can check out the first time they do the process. Then what you're going to see is that this information will have pulled over from the FSA ID. So the FSA ID and information and the FAFSA are completely connected and intertwined, okay? So it's going to pull over because the student logged in with their FSA ID. It's going to pull in this information. Now, there's one little interesting thing I've noticed here. There's something called the prototype, but I'm going to show you where you can find that at the end, where you can kind of walk through scenarios. And then there are these screenshots, which have come directly from federal student aid. Typically, they're telling us that people's information will come over from FSA ID, and they will need to update it there. And that is absolutely the case with this information here. But when I use the prototype, I can update address information. So I'm not sure that that can't be updated in the FAFSA, but that's one of those things I'm just going to throw out there. We try to stay on top of the changes, but we haven't seen a real 25-26 FAFSA yet. But definitely this top information, the only way it can be changed is by going back to the FSA ID and making a change there under settings. So it's going to pull over the student's state of legal residence. They will have to enter when they became a resident. Why that's important is because a lot of state grant programs require that a student be a resident of that state for a certain period of time to be eligible for a state grant if they have one. Now, here is what I was talking about in terms of providing consent and approval. So as you can see, right from the get-go, the student receives, because the student started the FAFSA, they're going to receive a page that looks like this. Here's the gist of it. This is a page that's providing them with information because it's going to be asking them to approve of allowing the IRS to transfer their tax information, if it exists, into their FAFSA, okay? Now, one of the things that's very interesting here is that if there is tax information available, it will transfer into the FAFSA, but it actually won't show in the FAFSA. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. Like if my tax information transfers over, it doesn't show it all in my FAFSA or in my FAFSA submission summary, but it is there and it does live behind the scenes. So I just want you to know that, okay? So the idea is that information will come directly from the IRS, and that is going to make the FAFSA so much easier to complete. Okay, so this is the bottom of the page. It's a really long page. They've got some FAQs. Every single individual has to provide consent and approval. Okay, so they have to consent and click that approve button. That includes even individuals who didn't file taxes. So if someone says to you, well, that's fine, but I didn't file taxes, why do I need to consent to have my information transferred from the IRS? And that is because not only does this process serve to have the tax information come over from the IRS, but it additionally confirms whether or not there even is any information with the IRS. So not everybody files taxes. So part of this process is confirming whether or not someone did or didn't file taxes. So absolutely everybody has to provide consent and approval. If people don't do that, the student is then ineligible for federal student aid. Good news is we did not have an issue with people doing this last year. People seem fine with it. So that's really good news. I was a little concerned, but they were good with it. Okay, so they click approve. And then this is new this year. And I'm so glad because this is going to make it, this screen didn't exist at all last year. So what happens is once you click that, it takes a moment, but it lets people know that their information is being imported. Last year, there was nothing that indicated that was the case. It just went on to the next slides. Not only is it showing people that their information is being imported, but it shows them that it was successfully imported. So they're going to, if information was with the IRS, it's going to let them know that that information has been successfully imported. But like I said, it's not going to show in the FAFSA or the FAFSA submission summary, but schools will receive those details. So even though you won't see it in your FAFSA, when a school gets that record, that ISER record is what we call the record the school gets with FAFSA data, all of the income information is going to show, so the schools will have all of those details, okay? So this is what a successful transfer looks like. If there was no data received, this is what it would say. So it would say that, yes, we did try to import your information, but there was no data there to be imported. All right, the next thing, because again, we're in the student section, the next thing the student is going to do is they are going to go through their personal circumstances, okay? Basically, there are many purposes for this, but one of the primary purposes of this personal circumstance section is to determine whether or not parent information is needed. So when the student starts the FAFSA, they provide information that determines, it's required by law, first of all, but it also determines whether or not the parent is going to have to provide any information on the FAFSA. We used to refer to these as the dependency status questions, but they renamed it the personal circumstances. So in this scenario, the student is single and never married, but if the student, for example, was married, they would automatically be considered independent. It wouldn't need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. The student is going to provide where they are, what year in school. These options have been narrowed with the new FAFSA that came into effect last year. So they'll indicate that they're a first-year student, second-year student, or an other undergrad, so juniors, seniors, fifth-year students. The option still exists, of course, that they are working on an advanced degree, a master's degree, or a doctoral degree. Keep in mind that when a student is working on their master's degree or their PhD or doctoral program, they are automatically considered independent, okay? Then they see a question that's going to ask if they've already completed their first bachelor's degree. This question is important because most of the time, there's an exception to it for teacher certification, but most of the time, and only at certain schools, but most of the time when a student already has their bachelor's degree, they're no longer eligible for federal Pell Grants or for Maine state grants. So this question is defaulted to no. So typically all undergraduates would be answering this question no. It should only be the graduate students that are answering yes to that. But we do see people inadvertently answer this question wrong. Now, these are the other, again, what we used to refer to as dependency questions. So this gets to some of the parent situations that we talked about a minute ago when the question was asked. So basically, anyone who is married, anyone who's a grad student, they're automatically considered independent. Additionally, anyone who can answer yes to any of these questions is going to automatically be considered independent and will not have to provide any parent information on their FAFSA. So you can, see these questions here, just real high level. It's basically anyone that's serving on active duty in the U.S. military for any purposes other than training, anyone who's a veteran that was honorably discharged, anyone who has children of their own or any individuals that they're providing more than half support for. Those individuals would be considered independent. So if someone, let's just say, has a child but isn't married, but is under the age of 24, which is another reason why you'd be independent, you would be considered independent if you had a child and you were providing more than half their support. Another scenario here, which we've absolutely seen, is we might have a student that's, let's say, 20, and the student, their family situation is complicated. Maybe they've got a younger sibling that's living with them, and they are providing more than half support to that younger sibling, or maybe their parent. That could even be the situation. Then they potentially could be considered independent if they're providing more than half their support. And then the other ones, I just want to make sure I see them all and get them all, is any student that any time since turning 13 was an orphan. So if parents have passed on, then the student is automatically, both parents have passed on, the student is automatically going to be independent. If the student has been a ward of the court any time since turning 13, they're automatically going to be considered independent. If the student, anytime since they've been 13, has been in foster care, they are automatically going to be considered independent. That's if they later are out of foster care. So let's just say we have a student who at 13 and 14 is in foster care. At 15, they reunite with their family. They still can check yes to this question, okay? So if at any time since turning 13, they're in foster care, they can say yes and will automatically be considered independent. If the student is or was legally emancipated minor, because of course they would be a was if they are over 18 or 18 or older, determined by the court in their state, they'll automatically be considered independent. And if the student is or was in the legal guardianship of someone other than their parent or step parent as determined by the court in their state of residence, they would also automatically be considered independent. What we see a lot these days is that sometimes students are living with grandparents, maybe because things have just, gone off the rails at home. So grandparents is where the students are living. And the first question we're going to ask them when they ask how do they fill out their FAFSA is we're going to say, do you have legal guardianship by the courts? And if they do have legal guardianship, the student will check yes to this question, and they will be considered independent. And so therefore, they will not have to provide any parent information on the FAFSA. Okay. If none of these apply, then they're going to click none of these apply, and they're still on the path to being considered a dependent student. There are two more questions related to the dependency piece. And this one is the student homelessness. So it asks if the student, anytime since July 1st of 2024, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So unfortunately, we know we have many more students that are in this situation. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some other scenarios where students might be unaccompanied and homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. But for now, let's assume, just to keep things simple for a moment, that this is not applicable to this student. The student is not in this situation. So they're going to say no. They're still on the path to being considered a dependent student. And then last but not least, it does ask, do you have unusual circumstances that prevent you from contacting your parent, or basically contacting your parent would pose a risk to you? So we have students out there who have left home because the situation is not safe for them. So they are living somewhere else. They don't have a connection with their parents. They might not know where their parents even are located. Maybe their parent is in prison, is incarcerated. Maybe they are a victim of human trafficking. So they do have various scenarios here. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more at the end. But let's say for now, this student that we're working with at the moment doesn't have any of those unusual circumstances. Okay, so we're going to continue on. And it has determined that the student is therefore considered to be a dependent student and needs to provide parent information on the FAFSA. Now, there are students out there, and I know probably all of you have run into them at this point in time, where the student is considered dependent. They don't have unusual circumstances. They couldn't answer yes to any of those dependency questions, but their parents still will not complete their FAFSA. So what the feds did, probably a decade or so ago, is they said, okay, well, for students in that situation, because that's a real tough situation for those students, they're not going to be eligible for, Pell Grants and all of that, but we will allow them to receive an unsubsidized student loan, direct unsubsidized loan only. Okay. So again, these are the students who have a relationship with their parents, no unusual circumstances, parents just won't do the form. They can say yes, and these students would be considered for an unsubsidized loan only. This was the worst question on the FAFSA last year, okay, because it was worded very differently. It was super confusing. So they have fixed it. So the way the question reads now is, are students' parents refusing to provide their information on the FAFSA form, and it's defaulted to no. So we think it's going to go a whole lot better. Apparently, the error rate has dropped dramatically since they've changed the wording. So this is defaulted to no. This should stay no in the vast majority of cases. At the very end, again, we'll talk a little bit about those other scenarios, but for now, this student is considered a dependent student. So because they're a dependent student, we want them to tell us about their parents, or the FAFSA needs them to tell them about their parents. So basically it's asking, are the parents married to each other? Because remember, we talked about all those different scenarios, married, not married, tax filing, all that. This is impacting who needs to provide information on the FAFSA and who has to sign in with an FSA ID. So in this situation, the parents are married to each other. So it says, based on your answers from the previous section, you'll need to provide information about both of your parents. And you can invite the parent to the form and have them complete the required sections. Okay, so the student says, all right, cool, I'm going to continue on. If the parents weren't married, they would see a variety of questions to help them determine which parent needs to complete this FAFSA. So next, the student sees this screen, and this is another one of those places where we probably have the most hiccups with the FAFSA in terms of people who were doing the FAFSA last year was around this section. So what the student does is they have to provide their parent information. Because what this is doing is this is creating that connection between the student section and the parent section. So the student is saying, this is who my parent is, so that the parent gets the invitation, and then the parent can go in and fill the parent section of the students of that student's FAFSA. So this is what connects the student section and the parent section and sends that invite. This information has to match what the parent used to create their FSA ID. Absolutely 100%, okay? Name, date of birth, social security number has to match. It also has to match what's on file with the Social Security Administration. So all of these things need to be in sync. So it's really important that when the student fills in this section, they put in their parent's legal name. My sister goes by Becky, but she's Rebecca. So that's what has to go in here. The date of birth has to be correct. My kids know my birthday. I'm not sure they know what year I was born without doing some math. So they could get that wrong. They could certainly put in my wrong social security number. They don't know it off the top of their heads. So in order for the student to start the FAFSA and to get their parent invited, they've got to know this information, okay? If they don't know this information, they're not going to be able to proceed. This will stop them. So this is why sometimes parents want to start the FAFSA. I just want to say that out loud, but federal student aid really does prefer students start the FAFSA, but this is the little catch part of it. The email address does not have to be the email address that was used when creating the FSA ID, okay? So I have my personal email address connected with my FSA ID, but the reality is if someone wants to reach me and have me get something quickly, my work email address is going to be that. So that does allow, this screen does allow the student to put in whatever email address is going to get to the parents. Nikki, hand raised.
Sorry, this is a great time to answer a question that we have in the chat.
Sure.
What does the parent invitation look for like for a second child completing the FAFSA? So like say,
know-
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish. I'm sorry.
Was thinking that would be a good time to mention this question. Is there a way for is there a way for parent information to be copied? Like it used to be, like we were doing, remember how we could move that parent information over? This is a two-parter. It's a great question.
Yeah, and I'm going to answer it in a way I hate to answer questions, which I don't know. And I really, really don't like it when I don't know how things work. I have not seen anything yet that addresses this. I do believe the vision is that once a parent has completed, because again, this is tied to the parent FSA ID, and that once the parent has completed a parent section for one student, that when they log in for the next student, that information would all pull over and be there. I don't think that is the way that it's working yet, though. I think that, as we all know, the FAFSA was so far from being ready to be released last year. All of the pieces were not working. They worked really hard. It is so much better. I feel really good about the upcoming year. But I will say for parents who have multiple kids, I think you're basically going to have to do this process twice. Nikki, Michelle, is there anything that you've seen that leads you to believe anything different?
I think, as a matter of fact, I've heard that wasn't available yet. But the good news is that like the parent section's so short. If they're being invited,
So short.
it's like seconds.
Yeah.
But also, can you touch on what that looks like when a parent has to do two FAFSAs?
I will. I will.
Okay.
I will.
I know you would.
Yes. So remind me though, don't let me forget. Okay. Because I think that's possible. Okay. So the student's going to finish this. Okay. And they're going to provide this information. Now there's, again, I'm along the same lines of me not knowing the answer to things, which I hate. And I also add that there's no renewal this year. Okay. But that apparently is coming in the future. Also, here, last year there was language that basically said if you only need one parent to, your parents are married and file a joint tax return, only fill this in for one parent. But that language is gone this year. And as you can see, as was the case last year, they can fill in two parents' information. This is Mila speaking, not federal student aid. Nikki, anyone else from FAM can contradict me if they think we should do otherwise. I only want them to put one parent in here, okay? I want them to put one parent in here. I want it to be a parent that they know has an FSA ID, okay? Even though there's two parent sections, okay? So they're going to do that. So the student's going to do that, and then that will send an invitation, okay? So keep over here. We're going to come back to it. Parent got an invitation. Meanwhile, students just going to trug along, okay? And they're going to finish their rest of their FAFSA. So they're going to provide some demographic information. They're going to indicate their gender, but they don't have to. It doesn't impact eligibility at all. It's not shared with anybody, not with the schools, not with us at FAME. So they can either answer this question or indicate that they prefer not to answer. Totally up to them. Same thing with race and ethnicity. They can answer, but they certainly do not have to. They can say that they prefer not to. No impact on eligibility. The student is then going to be asked their citizenship status. If they are a U.S. citizen or national, they will indicate that. If they are an eligible non-citizen, they will click on that, and through the magic of skip logic, they will see a new box and they will have to put in their A number, okay? So for any students who are eligible non-citizens, they will need that A number. That's critical for them to be eligible for federal financial aid. They're going to list their parents' education status. They did change up the responses to this last year, so it's a little less confusing now. So basically, if one or both parents have completed college, they would indicate that. If one or both parents attended college but neither completed, they'd indicate that. Basically, this question in Maine, we don't use it at all. Some states use it to determine which students are first generation, and because they have certain aid programs that are based on those students. So that's the purpose of this question. But here in Maine, we don't use it for that. So it doesn't matter, to be honest with you. I would ask people to answer it honestly and correctly, but it doesn't impact eligibility, and they can always say, I don't know. Now, this question here asks if the student had a parent or a guardian who was killed in the line of duty, serving on active duty as a member of the armed forces after 9/11, or official duties as like a public safety officer, so a police officer, a firefighter, emergency service worker. And the reason this question is asked, and it does default to no, but there are unfortunately students out there who have lost a parent under these circumstances. And if that's the case, these students are automatically eligible for a full Pell Grant. Okay, so that's the purpose of this question. If this is a yes, these students are automatically eligible for a full Pell Grant. The rest of their financial aid eligibility will be calculated based on their family's financial situation, but they will be eligible for that full Pell Grant. So if you know people in that situation, make sure they change that answer to yes. It's going to ask the student's high school completion status. So if the student has a high school diploma, we're going to see some of the next questions. But then some students are homeschooled, or some school students have a GED, or none of the above. So they are just going to answer that question correctly. For their circumstances, we're going to assume that they have a high school diploma. In that case, it's going to want them to indicate who their high school was. So there's a bunch of ways that people can search for this. They can search by putting in the state or the city name, and the city name. They can put in the high school if they know it. Sometimes high schools have a name that's a little bit different than what we call the high schools. So I tend to put in the state and the city and then do the search, and the search will bring up the correct school, and you click on that, and then students would confirm that and continue on. Then they're going to answer questions about their finances. So it's going to ask the student if they filed a tax return. If the student filed a tax return, we're going to see questions I'm going to show you in a moment. If the student did not file a tax return, they see no income questions. They might see some asset questions, but non-tax filers no longer have to provide any income information at all, okay? But in this scenario, we're going to say that yes, the student did file a tax return. Also, for this scenario, we are going to say that their tax information came over from the IRS. So this is one of those students who, when that transfer happened, it was successful. So behind the scenes, again, we can't see it here, they have their tax information. They have their adjusted gross income, the amount they paid in taxes, and things like that, okay? But even though their tax information did transfer over, there are still 4 questions that they are going to have to answer. And one of them is, did they have an IRA rollover or a pension rollover? Probably not as applicable to students, but the same questions are going to be in the parent section. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit more here. If I'm someone, and this actually happened, my husband changed jobs one year. And so he took his retirement and he had it rolled over from one account or work account to somewhere else. So on our tax return, it showed that we had an IRA distribution. But really, that was a rollover. We didn't pay taxes on it. We didn't have access to it. So therefore, it could be excluded. So the fact that we received that money, because we really didn't receive that money, it could be excluded. But for the purposes of filling out the FAFSA, you have to indicate that. So if a rollover, if an IRA distribution or a pension distribution is showing, and it truly was rolled over, they need to enter that here. If they fail to do that, then that distribution is going to show up in their adjusted gross income. So this is a super important question for those handful of people for whom this is applicable. Additionally, if the student had grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits on their tax return that they pay taxes on, we don't want those to count against the student. So again, it doesn't happen to a lot of students, but let's just say we've got a student out there and they have a ton of scholarship and grant money. So if their scholarship and grant money is only covering their tuition and fees, it's not considered income. They don't have to worry about it on their taxes. But let's just say this student files taxes, and not only did they have enough grant and scholarship money to cover their tuition and fees, but they even had enough grant and scholarship money to cover their housing or their room and board on campus if they were doing that. They have to report that as income if they file taxes. They want to list that here so it doesn't count against them. And then foreign earned income exclusion, I'm not even going to talk about that. I haven't seen anyone that's had that yet. Okay, so these are basically things that we want people to fill out this page correctly because we don't want these amounts of income that are in their AGI to count against them for financial aid purposes. That's the purpose of this slide. And then the next thing the student is going to see is they're going to see asset questions. And I know this is a little bit blurry, but I wanted to try to make it so you could read it. So students, if they're the first one to complete the FAFSA, they start the FAFSA, they're all going to see asset questions. Now, there are some circumstances under which assets are not going to be asked for or not going to impact financial aid eligibility. However, those circumstances are based on the parent income and the parent situation when the student is dependent. So if the student is starting the FAFSA and you're thinking, okay, I don't think the student's going to have to answer asset questions, know that if they're the one that is starting the FAFSA, they are going to have to, because we haven't gotten any parent information yet. But what I want to reassure you of, and why I'm going into this detail, is if they do provide the assets and it's determined that assets were not required, this will just all be excluded and ignored, okay? So have students fill this out, not worry about it, and let them know that it's in the parent section that will be determined whether those assets actually count. And then last but not least, in the student section, they are going to select their colleges. So they are going to list the colleges that they want this information sent to, so they can list up to 20 schools on their FAFSA. They want to list every school they've applied to. They want to list every school that they're planning to apply to, and they want to list every school that they think they might apply to this year. Okay, so they can put up to 20, so have them list any school that's on their radar for now. Again, they'll go through a search process, they'll find a particular school, and they will select those schools. So those will be on their FAFSA. If they decided later they want to remove one, they can do that. But basically here we're seeing a scenario where the student has listed 2 schools on their FAFSA. Both of these schools will get their FAFSA data once their FAFSA has been submitted and processed. And then we're done. So I know I talked for longer than it would take people to fill out this section of their FAFSA, okay? Here, what they can see is they can see all of the sections that they completed. If they think they made a mistake or they want to recheck something, they could click here. They can go back and fix those questions. On the bottom half of this screen, they will see that they have invited their contributor, and they will see that their contributor has not completed any of their sections yet. One of the things they did, thank goodness, this year, for anyone who did a lot of FAFSAs last year, remember last year it had signature down here, but it was always grayed out. And we were so confused by why they did it that way because you couldn't click on it. They just finally took it away. And instead, people just continue, which is what they always had to do. They will then see this section here. These are all the legal terms and conditions. Obviously, we want people to pay attention to those. But the student will ultimately come down here. They will check this box, which is who they are, and they will sign their FAFSA. Now, again, this scenario, the student is the person who started the FAFSA, so only the student section is complete. So the student only has the ability to sign the FAFSA. They can't submit it because for a dependent student, their FAFSA cannot be submitted until both the parent and student sections have been signed and completed and signed, okay? So then the student receives this. They see, okay, phew, my section's all complete. Again, they can see who their contributor is. They can learn a little bit of information about how they can track their FAFSA. And then this is the bottom part of that same screen. One thing that I do want to mention that exists, I don't recommend it. I go back and forth about this. But down at the very bottom here, do you see where it says provide parent information manually? When we do it on the other side, I'm going to show you a little bit more detail. But it is possible. If you have a student, let's say, for example, who is they're the one that's on top of this, and they're kind of pulling their parent along, the student could click on this and see the parent questions and fill that out for them. Now, the parent will still have to log in with their FSA ID, though, and sign the FAFSA. That still has to happen. But the student, even without the parent FSA ID, can click on this, complete all of the parent questions. Then the parent could come in with their FSA ID and simply sign the FAFSA. Okay, that scenario does exist. Again, I wouldn't probably use it across the board, but I did want you to know about its availability. I'm going to take a quick break here. Any questions? Because now I'm going to talk about what happens on the parent side, because the student's all set. Dependent student, they're good to go. Any questions before we move on?
Yeah, so we just had one pop in. So will it make much of a difference if a parent is recently retired versus still employed as far as what sort of aid they are awarded?
I would say that the year that they're using is 2023. So if a parent has just retired, they're still going to be using their 2023 income. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to provide whatever income, and what's going to show up on the FAFSA is any income from 2023. If that income is going to decrease dramatically, then what the parent needs to do is to follow up with the school that the student is attending, which if they're still searching for their school, that might mean following up with several schools, and let the school know that their income has changed. That's called a special circumstance or an appeal. And then the schools, case by case, and each school might be a little bit different, can take that into account and have the ability to use more updated information if they think it's appropriate, although they probably would want some documentation, okay? So that can be dealt with, but it's dealt with after the fact by working with the individual school. The FAFSA itself will not, from the parent's perspective, they will complete it only as they are required to, providing 2023 income information. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. So the student filled out that section in their section of the FAFSA where they provided their parent information. As a result of doing that, the parent would have gotten an email. And so they would have gotten an email, and I know you can't quite read this, but they would have gotten this email, and they can simply click on this link, and this will take them to studentaid.gov. Or I'm going to be honest, when I'm working with parents, I'm usually not having them go back and find this email. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm just having the parent go directly to studentaid.gov. So now the parent is going to go to studentaid.gov, and they're going to log in with their FSA ID, their username and password. What they're going to see on their dashboard right when they log in is that they're going to see that they have a pending invitation. And so when they click on that, then they will see this here. So it's going to tell them, hey, Jenny, which was the test case here, Jenny needs help. Jenny needs you to basically fill out the parent section of the FAFSA. And so then the parent would accept that invitation, okay? So the parent's going to accept that invitation. They're going to see, just this language here. This is what happens when you accept this invitation. They're going to click on continue. And then the parent is going to see those same 4 onboarding videos that the student saw when they started their FAFSA. They only see this the first time they file a FAFSA for that particular year. So there's 4 of them. I only showed you the one. The parent is going to see the student's, this is the parent's information. This one I can't read. This is the parent's information. Okay, so just like the student, when the student logged in, they see their information. Again, they cannot update this information on the left here unless they go to studentaid.gov and go into their FSA ID settings and change things. I do think they can update their address, but this screenshot is not showing that. So we'll have to see when the real FAFSA comes out how that actually works. The parent is now going to provide consent. So this is the same as on the student side. I'm going to go through this section a lot more quickly because a lot of this stuff is the same in the parent section as it was in the student section. Provides a summary of the information, the same FAQs, and the parent is going to indicate that they approve to have their tax information sent over from the IRS. Again, if it's going to tell them it's importing. If it's successful, it's going to show them that it was successful. If it wasn't successful, or if there was no data there, it's going to tell them that. Okay, so this works exactly like the student section. But if you ever get confused here, or you forget, when I'm working with a student, sometime I'm like, okay, which section are we in? Right at the top here, it's going to tell you, okay, I am the parent of Jenny completing this form. So I'm answering questions about myself. So I am going to answer demographic information. In this case, I'm answering parent marital status. For the purposes of this scenario, we're going to say parents are married. It's going to ask us parent state of legal residence and when that was the case. And then we're going to get to parent finances. So parent finances, I'm going to click on this. And this is a slide I want to spend a moment on because this goes back to who has to provide asset information and who doesn't have to provide asset information. So a lot of our families in Maine do not have to provide asset information because it's not required in several scenarios. The first of which is if the family earns less than $60,000 a year, depending on whether they have to file schedules or not, they will not have to provide any asset information on the FAFSA. They won't have to provide any parent asset information. And if student asset information has already been provided, it's going to be excluded. Okay, so that's one way in which people don't have to provide any assets. Another way is if a family or anyone in their family received any federally means tested benefits If they say yes to any of these, then assets are excluded for the parent and the student. So that's everything from the earned income credit to main care to SNAP to TANF, okay? Any one of these, if any one member of their family has received these and they click this, then no assets are required. Now, I hate to go revisit the darn free and reduced lunch question, but I'm going to. So last year, we were initially instructed that everyone, we had universal free and reduced lunch here in Maine, that everyone who got free and reduced lunch could say yes to this question. 2 or 3 days after the FAFSA came out, they came out with something that said that was not the way it was. So the only people who should say yes to free and reduced lunch are people who actually are eligible for free and reduced lunch based on their income. Okay? So anyone here who can say yes to any of these, assets are going to be excluded. Again, student might have already provided them, but they will be excluded, and parent won't even see that they will be asked for assets. Asking if the parents filed taxes. In this case, the parent says, yes, I did file taxes. And just a question, did you file taxes with your current spouse in 2023? Because that was, over a year ago. So that might have been the case that they are no longer together. So it asked that question. And then what the parents are going to do is they're going to see this question. And I did not quite get how this was working behind the scenes last year. But what this does is it is calculating what they believe the family size to be. And that's based on the marital status of the parents, because this is a dependent student, the marital status of the parents, as well as the number of exemptions. So in some cases, that is accurate. So we've got a married couple, they've got 2 kids, they're claiming both of their kids on their tax return. The family size behind the scenes, I can't show us because again, it's federal tax information, but it's 4, right? Married, 2 parents, 2 dependents, 2 exemptions, okay? So 2 dependents is what I should have said there. So it's going to be a family of 4. If I know that that's accurate and that's my situation, I just continue on. But let's just say that it's a situation where there is a divorce and they alternate maybe who claims that child. And so maybe what was on the 23 tax return is not reflective of their family size. Then they will say no. And if they say no, they will then see their family size and they will be able to put in the correct number of people. So based on the FAFSA, it is going to calculate the family members that they already know about. So in the case of this situation, I'm a married couple. So I've got one parent and then I've got another parent because they're married. And then I've got the student. So that's how we get to a family size of 3. If there are another child or 2 or 3 that are in the household or other dependents, I would add that number into this box here. It immediately will populate this number with the correct one, okay? But you never include the student in this box, okay? Because the student is already taken into account. Parent, spouse, and student, that's how we got to 3. So we're just going to add in anyone else. Now, last year, I wanted people to check this box because I didn't quite understand how it was working. I don't want people to open this up and change this unless they need to this year. And that's because it creates the possibility of being selected for verification. Okay, so if you feel like the tax situation in 23 was accurate and reflective of the current, you would have just left this previous screen at, was there, is it different? You'd say no, and you continue on. But if it is different, you'd say yes, and you'd provide this information. Then it's going to ask, how many of those people are in college? Now, the number in college no longer impacts financial aid eligibility. But the school does receive this information. So you still want to fill this out. Maybe some schools are being proactive about this. I'm not sure, but you can always follow up with the school and let them know that. Again, parents here, their tax information was transferred over in the scenario that we're talking about. They see those 4 questions that I discussed with the student. So then the parents are going to see the asset questions. Again, if they do need to provide assets, if they don't need to provide assets, they wouldn't even see these questions. But one of the weird things now is because the untaxed section is gone, that child support is reported as an asset. And child support is supposed to be listed for the most recently completed tax year. So if someone's filing this FAFSA in December, they are going to provide child support received in 2023, because that's the last year that was completed. If they don't do their FAFSA until January, they're going to use child support that was received in 2024, because that year was the most recently completed year. I don't know why they chose to do it that way, but that's what they did. Parents are going to provide their assets. It's as of the day the FAFSA is filed that you need to list assets. Keep in mind that primary residence, retirement values, and personal possessions are all excluded from the FAFSA. Now, if parents are married and parents need to provide, okay, if parents are married, the other parent's information is required on the FAFSA. So my scenario, if I'm filling out the FAFSA, I logged in with my FSA ID, I said I was married, I filed a joint tax return with my husband. He does not need to log in with his FSA ID, but I still do need to provide some information about him. And I need to provide that information because this is the way that they verify behind the scenes that the person for the imported tax information is my current spouse, okay? So that's why I have to provide my spouse's information, even if we filed a joint tax return. But he won't need to log in and provide any additional information. I'm not showing this scenario, but if you, for example, if parents didn't file a joint tax return, you would still provide this information, and then parents would indicate who that other parent was, and that other parent would get an invitation and they would log in with their FSA ID. But in this scenario, we didn't need to do that. Okay, so I just provided my husband's demographic information, and that's all that needed to happen. We're now at the end. I've provided this information here. Again, I can click on this box. I can update anything, or once I'm ready, I can just continue. But as noted over here, parents cannot see their student questions. So what the FAFSA has really done is, if you think about the admissions application process, it's not a big surprise that everything that the school communicates about admissions is sent directly to the student. Works the same way with the FAFSA. Everything is going to the student directly. The student can grant permission for the school to talk with parents about it, but the initial default is that all the information is going to the student, and the parent cannot see a lot of this information, including what the student put on their FAFSA. So then once they're the last contributor, they will read down through this, they will click on the box. Not only can they sign it, but they will submit it, okay? Because in this scenario, the student filled out the student section, it's all signed, good to go. The parent's the last one in, filled out their section, they've signed it, and they can sign and submit all in one fell swoop. So then the student's going to get, the parent's going to get this page, tells them, congratulations, here's what happens next. The student will receive an email. I'm going to show you that in just a second. And here's what that looks like. So this is last year's email. I don't have an updated version of this email, but I doubt it will change tremendously. Again, the parent does not get this email. The student gets this email. And so the student would receive information on what their SAI was and some other information depending on what this has been updated to say for the coming year. Now, just very briefly, in the essence of time, what happens if the parent started the FAFSA? So I'm not going to go through the screens. I'm just going to go through the flow. So if the parent started the FAFSA, what they will do is they will provide the student's identifying information. That's the information that will be used to send the student invite. So the parent will provide the student name, social, date of birth, etc. The parent will still see those onboarding questions. And then the parent will have to answer the dependency questions, because if the parent starts the FAFSA, they've got to be sure that parent information is needed, right? So in this scenario, the parent would first provide the answers to those dependency questions, and then they would see this question that we saw on the student side, that yes, it does look like the student is dependent. We saw that unsub question again. And then the parent would finish off with what we just saw a moment ago by reviewing their identity, providing consent and approval, providing the demographic information and their financials, and then they would sign the FAFSA, okay? So the scenarios are very similar, but I just wanted to point out that whoever goes in first, if the student starts the FAFSA or the parent starts the FAFSA, the the dependency questions have to be answered to determine whether parents even need to go through this process. If the parent started the FAFSA, then the student will receive that invitation. Okay, so they'll log into studentaid.gov, they'll get an email, but they can just log into studentaid.gov, they'll accept the invitation, and then they will finish their student section of the FAFSA. They will provide their other demographic information, they will list their schools, and they will provide their financial information. Just like on the student side, if the parent started the FAFSA and they wanted to complete as much of the FAFSA as possible for the student, they could do that without logging into with the student's FSA ID, but the student would still need to log in with their own FSA ID to sign the FAFSA. The parent cannot do that on their behalf. Okay, so regardless of who's completing the demographic information, the student financials, the colleges would be completed. Student might do this themselves. That's what I'd recommend. Some parents will want to do it on behalf of students. They can do that if they click that link. But either way, the student does at a minimum have to log in with their FSA ID in order to provide consent and sign the FAFSA. All right, couple things. I know we're getting short on time, so I just want to run through a couple of other scenarios. Independent students, I know we tend to focus on dependent students. It's really because for independent students, all this is a lot simpler. So they will basically see all of the questions that the dependent students saw, but they will see a couple of additional questions. So where we saw the family size and the number in college questions in the parent section, an independent will see those questions as well, because the independent student may be married and may have kids of their own. So those questions are relevant. And so those will show up in the student section for an independent student. If the student is married, then the student will need to invite their spouse, just like the student invited their parent. If it was a joint tax return that was filed in 2023, their spouse will not need to sign in with their own FSA ID. But if the student, they maybe were recently married, and so the student and their spouse did not file a joint tax return, then their spouse is going to need to have their own FSA ID and sign in so they can provide consent. A couple of other scenarios that I said I would come back to. In the situation where the student indicates that they don't meet any of those circumstances to be considered independent, they are dependent, then they are going to go ahead and say, yes, I do want an unsub only, but they would have to follow up with the school, okay? So they do get, first of all, let me just say, they do get this box to confirm that that's what they really meant to do. So this is the new pop-up box. But if that really is their situation, they will continue. And then they need to follow up with the school that they're going to in order to actually take the steps to receive that unsubsidized loan. Now, I do want to talk a moment about students who are homeless. So if you have a student that you're working with that's homeless, there are kind of two pathways for them. There's the pathway where they say, yes, I was unaccompanied and homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. One quick thing that I want to point out here is that if a student is homeless, the only way they're considered independent is if they are unaccompanied. So if I had a student who was living in a homeless shelter with their parents, they would not answer yes to this question because they are not unaccompanied. A student who is homeless living in a shelter with their parent would still need their parent. They would still be considered dependent and still need their parent to fill out the FAFSA. Obviously, probably based on their circumstances, are going to be eligible for the maximum amounts of financial aid available, but they do have to provide their parent information. But in this scenario, let's just say the student is homeless. They're going to say yes. Then they're going to see these questions here. And if any one of these four individuals can indicate that they can document that the student is, that this has already been determined that they are homeless, the student will click that. So let's just say the most common one that we see is that the student's high school has designated that they're homeless. So the student would check yes to that box and then would continue, and it would say to them, okay, you're independent, just like it would have if they were in foster care anytime since being 13, or they were 24. It would say, okay, yes, you're independent. The school may still want some documentation of that, but basically they're saying, yep, you're independent, no parent information required, you're good to go. There's also a scenario, though, where none of these four organizations can document that. Let's just say it's a student who maybe is 20, they're not in high school, they haven't been in high school for a few years, or maybe they weren't homeless when they were in high school. They're not living in an emergency shelter. They haven't talked with the financial aid office yet. They were never in a TRIO program or something like that. No one can document that they have been determined to be homeless. They can say none of these, right? None of these apply to me, and click continue. But what's going to happen in their case is they're going to see this slide, which says that they're provisionally independent or unaccompanied, which means that yes, they're on the pathway to being independent, but they have to follow up with their school and work with their school and provide documentation or have that conversation in order to officially be considered independent. They only have to do that the first time as long as they stay at that school, but that does have to take place, okay? So that's when no one has yet determined officially of those organizations that that student is homeless. The school, the college will then be the organization that will determine that. Then that question about unusual circumstances. If a student did have those unusual circumstances, let's just say maybe one parent had passed away, the other was in prison, or they had left their home because they weren't safe. Maybe they're living with that grandparent, and it's not safe for them to be in contact with their parent, but the grandparent doesn't have legal guardianship. Then they would say yes here. And what they would see is the same screen, that they are considered provisionally independent, but they do need to follow up with their college and provide the necessary documentation. They will not get aid unless they do that. I wanted to just show you too, if there was the manual pathway, if tax information did not come across, here are other screens that parents would need to fill out, or students, they're very similar. So you can see that even if people do have to manually enter their tax information, there's not a tremendous number of questions, nowhere near as many as there used to be, but there certainly are more than there are if the information comes over automatically from the IRS. And that's why that's the best case scenario, because not only does it come over and make it easier, but it means it's automatically verified. FAFSA should be processed in 1 to 3 days. We're back to that, which is delightful. If the student goes back and logs into their FAFSA, they will see these options available. They go to My Activity. This is my actual screen from this current year. So they could click on their FAFSA, and then what they can see is this FAFSA form details. They can see the status of their FAFSA. But as importantly, and what I really wanted to point out here is this is where they can see a copy of their FAFSA submission summary, okay? Other things they can see on this is they can see the action button over here. So when I click on that, this is how I would add schools, remove schools, make corrections, or view my FAFSA submission summary. You're going to find that there's often a couple of ways to get to the same place. So you can click here to get the FAFSA submission summary, or you can view it up here. It's going to take you to that same location. So if we look at the FAFSA submission summary, what we're going to see here is when it was received, when it was processed, that data release number, that if a college has that, they can import the student's ISA records, their FAFSA records, even if the school wasn't listed. We can see this is their second submission. Here's where they can print a PDF copy or a paper copy of their FAFSA submission summary. All of those students that we need to be applying for the Worthington Scholarship who are high school seniors, we want them to be doing this, print this off right now, save it to their desktop so they can provide it to the Worthington Foundation as part of their application. And then you're going to see there are these sections to the summary. The overview section is where you see what they potentially are eligible, but only for federal aid. Can't tell anyone about any state or school aid at this point. Only the school can do that. But at the bottom of this page is where you will see that student aid index. Students will be looking for that. For Worthington, for example, they just have to have a student aid index less than 30,000. So that's going to be awesome this year. They can see their form answers. So if they needed to update something, you don't make updates technically to the FAFSA, you only make corrections. If you made a mistake, you can fix it. And here's how you could do that. You would click on make a correction and it would walk you through that. Here's where all the schools are listed, so they can see what schools are receiving their information. And again, they can add more schools by clicking on that action button I showed you a moment ago, if desired. And then last but not least, I'm just going to rip right through this. I will stay on as long as people want me to answer questions, but I know we're already up against it. I just wanted to share with you some of the resources that we have. So first of all, website resources available to you as educators. If you go to faymain.com/educators, we have the FAFSA prototype. I really recommend you walk through it if you're anxious to get a look at the FAFSA and see the different scenarios ahead of time. It's really pretty cool. We have all of the FAFSA screenshots. I showed you a sampling today. The PDF has over 300 screenshots of all of the various scenarios, so you can check out the others there. There's an estimator so that students can check out what they think their SAI would be by using the estimator. This is where Tuesday's tips lives if you want to revisit those. This is also where all of our Wednesday webinar recordings and PDFs can be found. On the FAFSA filing page at famaine.com/FAFSA, here you can find that parent wizard. There's a cool new tool that people can use to determine which parents need to have an FSA ID. That wizard will help them with that. That's one way you can get to our tracking, our FSA ID tracking sheets, our FAFSA tips, and FAFSA FAQ. For families and students, we have FAFSA help sessions. We have virtual and in-person sessions. All of our virtual events can be found on the website, on our events page. We do have people register just so we are prepared, but we would love to have people join us. They're going to start on December 11th and run through January 21st, with more being added if needed. You can always contact FAME as well by calling us or emailing us. We would love to have families who to sign up and get texts and or emails from us. They can go to famaine.com/join to do that. For members of the class of 25, because we so badly want to be in touch with them and provide them up-to-date information. If they sign up for texts or emails, we're going to automatically put them in a drawing for one of 3 $1,000 scholarships. Parents can join our Facebook group, Paying for College for Me, and we do have one-on-one financial aid coaching. People can sign up for our free appointment with us, half hour, 45 minutes. We will spend time talking about any part of this process they desire. FAFSA completion, comparing offers, paying the rest of the bill, you name it, we'll talk about it. And then last but not least, I just wanted to let you know that we do have the FAFSA portal available to high schools. The eligible high school counselor, the one who signed the agreement, can log in and see the FAFSA completion status of their seniors. Each high school can select, this is our public high schools, can select one individual to have access, but a data agreement does need to be signed. If you have no idea what I'm even talking about, but you're at a high school and you want to know more, or you've had a change in counselors and you know that the counselor who did have access has left, will you please reach out to me and I will share all sorts of additional information with you. Data will not be available until January. I put late January here. I'd like to think it'd be earlier in January, but we rely on not only FAFSA data being available, but we need the Maine Department of Education to share with us all the census data for the class of 25, and we won't get that until typically early January. All right. That is what I have. I'm 2 minutes over. I'm sorry. Whew. How's everyone doing? Okay. Do we have additional questions? This so I don't forget to this. I'm going to stop recording. Bear with me, and I'm going to stop sharing.
We had a great question in the chat. Just to make sure, like the FAFSA will open December 1st. And I did say it's going to open December 1st, but we do want to get folks signed up to get our texts and emails so that we can keep them up to date. Because we really expect there to be some downtime. I'm sure that the site will close for maintenance at some point in time. So
yeah, I think it's multiple things. We'd like to get them signed up so we can share any little hiccups if there are any. We're hoping there won't be, but we want to, let them know that the FAFSA is available because they might forget. It's a busy time of year. We want to encourage them to get it done. I wouldn't do it the first day or two personally. I'd wait for a couple of days, but we'd love to have them get it done in the month of December. But we'll also send them like a resource to compare financial aid offers. We'll just put that in a link just so they'll have that available and just really highlight some of the really critical steps in the process. So we joke that we won't inundate people because we have to write all these texts and emails. So, 1, maybe 2 a month at the most. But it is really important information, we think, and we do want to be able to share that. All right, I'm going to stop recording.